Hi everyone. Today I've added a new feature to the slides where I try to have subtitles. So today's lecture is the first lecture of the term, first substantive lecture of the term, where we're going to sort of get through some of the key terms in international politics. So before I start, though, I should remind you that if you have any questions about the syllabus, you can send me an email, come to my virtual office hours, or just message me on MS Teams. Those are all different ways of getting a hold of me. So please take a moment to watch the previous video and then also orient yourselves with the syllabus. Like I discussed in the last class, the way that I have sort of structured this lecture or this course is sort of going to be around a question of COVID, but obviously it's not sort of a course on COVID. So what we're doing is using COVID as an analogy or sort of as an example to make our way deeper into international politics. Now in this course, when I'm teaching this course, I'm using two different terms or two different spellings of one concept called international relations. Lowercase international relations here refers to everyday world politics, things like diplomacy, war, trade, things that happen that you read about in the news. So that's the lowercase international relations. Capital case international relations refers to the academic discipline that studies international relations, or the lowercase international relations. So when you're thinking about it, that's the discussion that we make. So I'm a professor of international relations, that I study international relations in the lowercase sense of the word. So what I do is, in a way, try to make sense of the world. And how do I do that? How do I sort of provide an insight that is different than perhaps what someone who just reads the news or sort of watches a lot of YouTube videos does, is that I use something called theory. Now, what is theory? Theory is a way of abstracting the world. It's creating sort of an abstraction of the world in an attempt to make sense of the world. So you look at the world, you see the events, you see what's happening, and you put forward different hypotheses, different theories. There are existing theories in the field of international politics. This course is, in a way, an introduction to those theories. So theory does three different things, or different theories possibly do three different things. A theory can be contemplative. It could be generalizable. It could be abstract. A theory could also be normative or prescriptive. It could sort of tell the world, let me rephrase this, tell the way a world should be. Or a theory could be an explanatory tool in an attempt to understand what is happening in the world. So in so many ways, there is a direct relationship between the lowercase IR and the capital case IR. Because the field of international relations studies the empirical world of international relations. And moving on, we're going to talk about the concept of practices, concept of discourses, concept of praxis as a way of bridging that divide of sort of theory and event, the world politics as a sort of an empirical sphere, and then world politics as a theoretical sphere or an academic sphere. But a way in which I want to do that in this course, in this particular sort of variation of this course in 2020, is by looking at COVID-19. I don't know why I wrote COVID-10 there, but it's actually COVID-19. This is what the virus looks like. And virus is a really interesting object, right? Essentially, virus is a non-living organism, or sort of an organism that doesn't live on its own. It requires a host to sort of then sort of reproduce, take over, and in a way define its existence. So in relation to the course, I ask a different question. I don't ask what is COVID-19. I don't ask what it does. I don't ask how it impacts the human body. I asked global set of questions. So the first question would be to sort of say, how did COVID-19 become a global pandemic? And there's different ways of answering that question. You can sort of go in a perfectly empirical way and sort of say, okay, COVID-19 was a virus that started in China in Wuhan province and then sort of made its way across internal borders of China and then sort of globally through sort of global interconnectivity. That would be an empirical response. But then there's different sets of questions here, right? There's also sort of a level of abstraction and a level of theorization that is required to perhaps ask a different set of questions. So rather than ask the question of like, how did COVID-19 become a pandemic or global pandemic, you can ask yourselves, how did COVID-19 become an entity or a concept that we understand globally, both across borders, but also as a universal understanding? So ask yourselves this question. What do you understand when I say COVID-19? What are the things that come to your mind? Is it's a virus that kills people? It's a virus that makes people sick. It overburdens the healthcare system. It has an impact on everyday life. But it also has other impacts. It has an impact on shutting down the Canada-US border. It has an impact on impacting global mobility, curbing personal freedoms, changing the way that we live our lives. Changing architecture, changing the physical spaces that we live, changing culture, changing the way in which we understand society. Think about the very concept, and we'll talk about this further on in sort of like our understanding of developing what an international issue is. But think about this moment when we're thinking about concepts like the Atlantic bubble, or sort of people feeling like, oh, I see an Ontario license plate. Have they self-isolated? I see I see an American license plate. How did they get in? You start thinking about these sort of ideas of borders and boundaries and limits in different ways. So you start thinking about the impact with which COVID-19, in a way, made us much more local and much more national than maybe we thought we were in March. So you can look at it this way. You can look at it as sort of like a biopolitical map and sort of say, oh, look at the United States, it's blowing up. Oh, in Canada, we're doing well. Oh, South America, there's issues in Brazil. Or India, what's going on there? Or China has handled this virus. But then you can ask different set of questions as well. You can ask, what makes the United States handle the virus so poorly? What makes Canada address it so relatively well? What makes internal differences in Canada? What is COVID-19? And that question, and the answers that I'm going to give is in the next slide. But that question can be answered differently, and it will depict a very widely different reality depending on the question you're asking. So, COVID-19 could be seen as what it is. It's a health crisis, it's a pandemic, it's a global pandemic. But then, meaning of pandemic can be very different things, right? We've used terms like flattening the curve, or we wait every day to see how many people have had tested positive in this province, in that province, in this country. We talk about waves of the virus, etc. We can also talk about it as an economic crisis. Like in March, when the workplaces shut down, there was a moment of great anxiety in the global economy. What's going to happen? If people are not working, how are we going to make money? How are we going to pay bills? How are we going to pay mortgages? How are we going to pay interest? Because everything is connected. And as everything is connected, it has a trickle-down effect. So some states intervened and provided support. Some states did not. Some states put things like rent subsidies. Some states did not. Another question is COVID-19 a security crisis? Like, one way to look at it is to sort of say, hey, COVID-19 is just another moment. It's just another event. It's just another health issue. But we're closing borders. We're approaching differently. We're saying public health. We're issuing public health orders. We're issuing states of emergency. So it has a security component too. Another question would be, is this a crisis of global governance? A lack of trust or lack of support for something like the World Health Organization has undermining effects on our ability to understand the virus, right? This is a new virus that started like first case, depending on where you stand, somewhere between December, January, November. So November of last year, December, January, from patient zero to sort of pandemic by March. So if WHO had the ability to do what it did historically, what you would, and WHO stands for the World Health Organization here, if it had the ability to do what it historically had done, or if it had done what it historically had done, there would be a free flow of information and science would not be sort of bound by national boundaries. But what we're seeing is also a crisis of global cooperation, whether states competing among themselves to find a vaccination and produce that vaccination in mass quantities, or to sort of keep the virus outside of their borders. So the way in which we do this, we understand this, is through understanding international relations. So in this course, we're going to use different theories of international relations to perhaps provide insights into these questions, but also by making those points, we're also going to sort of then come back and make general understandings or inferences about what international relations is. So in our discipline, we use different methods to develop the relationship between theory and practice. So we ask questions of, well, how do we know what we know? And this is sort of a question of perhaps reality, right? We ask ourselves, what is real? What is real about international politics? Because at the end of the day, when you're living in Nova Scotia, it's not like sort of you are firsthand witnessing some of these events. So you have to rely on the data that you're getting, right? So I think in this course, there's going to be a term that I will use quite frequently, which is going to be a term called biopolitics, and it's about the governance of life. But there is no perhaps a singularly clear example of biopolitics as looking at the stats or looking at the numbers, global numbers of COVID-19, because it's a complete abstraction, right? We sort of understand the waves of the virus or impact of the virus in these abstract numbers, right? So I think today or yesterday, United States just passed 200,000 deaths. 200,000 deaths is a huge number, a massive number in terms of human casualty, human loss of life. But if you sort of start thinking about it in the way in which those numbers are trickling every day, they don't necessarily mean all that much to you when you're healthy, right? Like, because you can sort of say, okay, 200,000 people died, but if you're not one of those people who are infected, then you have different kinds of concerns like economics, etc. So you're not paying attention to those numbers. Or if you don't know one of those people, you're not looking at those numbers in the same way. So this question of real becomes a question of being seen, being visible, being felt, being experienced. So if we're not experiencing these things, how do we know what we know? And there is something about politics that is essentially discursive, right? So there's a narrative to international politics, just as there is to domestic politics, that shapes how we understand events. That is, whether that's sort of a media coverage, whether that is what news sources we choose to read, or what sort of places we get our facts from. Discourses impact our understanding of the real. If you've seen the movie The Matrix, which I would completely recommend, I think it's still available on Netflix. It's a pretty decent movie, the first one in particular, where there's a scene where they're talking about how the world has changed and what they think to be the world is not the world. And Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, tells Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, the world that you think you know does not exist. And here he shows him this sort of scene of the world where he thinks is at the beginning of the 21st century, and then shows him the sort of the real, the sort of real that people do not know. So he calls it the desert of the real. So then that's a good way of thinking about it. What do you think that we know about international politics? And how do you know that? What is the comfort, or what is the sort of trust that you have in the facts that you're learning? So I ask you to think about what counts as knowledge. in this course, when you're thinking about world politics, to you, what is a satisfactory source of knowledge? How do you make a distinction between fact and fiction? Right? How do you make a distinction between fictions of world politics and facts of world politics? Or how do you make a distinction between fact versus ideology? What you think to be true because of an ideological allegiance that you have versus the facts on the ground. Or facts versus beliefs. How do you make a distinction between facts versus beliefs? Because you believe in something might not necessarily be living up to the litmus test of this course. So we think about these sort of broader branches of understanding and knowledge in or within this field called the philosophies of science or philosophies of social science. So we ask questions of what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? These are more questions of epistemology than ontology. Now I've just used a term called epistemology. Some of you may have heard that term before. Some of you may have never heard that term before. Epistemology studies the nature of knowledge. So it sort of looks at how we learn, how we prove the existence of facts, how we distinguish beliefs from facts. So it doesn't just sort of say 2 + 2 should equal 4, but how? What do we need to know to make the case? What do we need to understand in terms of the practices of mathematics to understand that 2 + 2 equals 4? Now, there's a secondary field here that you need to understand before perhaps you can get into the questions of epistemology, and that is the questions of ontology. And ontology looks at studies of nature, studies of being, and what and how exist in reality, and how do we understand general questions of existence. So to go back to that 2 + 2 equals 4, what do we need to know before we can come to the point of adding 2 to 2 to make 4? That's the key issue here. What is it that we need to know? What is the a priori or the priori knowledge we need to have to make the case that 2 + 2 equals 4? So to take this to sort of what we're talking about in this class, to research international politics, to research international relations, what do you need to know? So when I say this course is about international relations or global politics, ask yourselves, before I even talk more, ask yourselves in this moment, right now, maybe pause this video and ask yourselves, what do I think he's talking about? What are my preconceived assumptions? So if there was an assignment and I sort of said, paint me global politics, what are you going to paint? Are you going to put tanks? Are you going to put weapons? Are you going to put money? Are you going to put men? Are you going to put Europe? Are you going to put, colonialism? Where is global politics? What is global politics to you? When you close your minds, what do you think you imagine? Right? Because politics is one of those things that is not always tangible, right? Like when we think of politics, we think of perhaps a president or a prime minister or a political party. But like, if I sort of said, what does politics taste like? Well, I don't know. What do you do? Go and lick the parliament? Like, what do you sort of figure out? Even that question of like licking the parliament or that concept, it's weird because is it politics only something that happens in institutions? Do you have does international politics have an impact on your everyday life? Like I teach this other course called Global Issues, and Global Issues, we sort of connect everyday activities to our everyday lives and sort of like how globalization or global sort of connects those two things. And, if there is no global politics, if there is no global consensus, global agreements, you can't mail stuff, you can't have internet, you can't have bananas. Most things that you eat in front of you, unless you're like making a very conscious decision to buy local, comes from all around the world. Everything that we're wearing is made in, tens of different places, from the fabric to the workmanship to the shipment, etc. So researching international relations requires you to have perhaps different kinds of openness to both epistemology, but also on ontology. So you need to look at not just the state, but you need to look at citizens, you need to look at NGOs, you need to look at different actors. At the same time, if you're thinking about what is an event, maybe it's not just numbers, maybe it's a combination of numbers and feelings and discourses. So you need to look at an openness. So, social world that we study in this course is complex. So you might as well embrace the mess, right? A social network is a complex entity. Interactions are everywhere. An agency exists in all sorts of different places. So, be creative in your analysis. Be creative in establishing linkages between things. Causality is emergent. Small actions can have very large conditions or consequences. So focus on the conditions of possibility, right? Like probably the most sort of like one of the most epic stories of complete set of emergent causalities is Lord of the Rings. Like who would have thought that Smeagol, who goes fishing and finding a ring in the middle of the river, in the bottom of the river, would result in all sorts of different sets of activities, right? Like, obviously, if you've read the Lord of the Rings saga, you would know that the ring always wants to be found. Ring always wants to be returned to Sauron. But the set of events that unfold as a result of a ring being found results in, the whole epic of the Lord of the Rings. In the same way that, like the whole like butterfly effect theory of like a butterfly flapping its wings in the Sahara Desert and creating a disturbance in the atmosphere, which then it becomes, Hurricane Teddy outside, given the right conditions and the right kind of emergence. Remember that research is political, and that with power comes responsibility, to sort of quote, what is it? Peter Parker's uncle's name? I forget, but to quote Spider-Man, the genre, not the individual, with great power comes great responsibility. So, in this class, when you're engaging in your sort of briefing papers, or when you're engaging about the sort of the thought exercise, if you follow this class, it does come with responsibility. So when you're making theoretical choices, when you're making abstractions, be cognizant of the fact that you're actually sort of engaging in an agency of your own and you're making conscious decisions. So, in this class then, one of the things that we ask about COVID is how do different theories conceptualize or theorize the crisis? So what would that sort of tell us? And to do that, we have to perhaps take a moment in this particular lecture and ask ourselves some important questions about key concepts in international relations. So there's 4 concepts or 4 sort of items that I'm going to explain in the next little while. First is the question of human nature. Then we're going to talk a little bit about anarchy. Then rational choice or choice, and the structure and agency debate. Let's start with the concept of anarchy. I'm just going to have a sip of my water. It's weird to just talk to a camera. Probably my neighbors think that I am being really random right now. So let's take a moment and ask ourselves, what do we think of anarchy? And I'm not just talking about, anarchy in the UK, streets and fire, whatever. That's not what we're talking about in this discipline or in this class. Anarchy does not equal chaos in international politics. What it actually refers to is this sort of understanding, and it comes to English through medieval Latin and then from ancient Greek, of anarchia, from like the word anarchos. So that refers to being without a leader or a chief or a ruler. So anarchy in international politics refers to having no central authority, no world government, no police force. So when we say international politics is anarchic, we're not saying international politics is chaotic. What we're saying is that anarchy represents a structural limit in international politics. There is no global government. There is no world police. So if you're if you are attacked by another country, if you're a state and if you're being attacked by another country, there is no 911. There is no one to call. So what that means is that there is no overarching government in international politics. So some theories look at this and sort of say, hey, this undermines cooperation and makes conflict a possibility. Other theories look at it and sort of say, hey, you know what? This probably would cause people to cooperate, states to cooperate. And also sort of for others, like sort of constructivists, it makes it possible to think about, well, okay, so if anarchy is a constant of world politics, they would ask, or they would say, how come that international relations between United States and China is different than international relations between United States and Canada? So there must be something that is different about anarchy. So it must be not just a sort of anarchy is a constant. It's that anarchy probably is what states make of it. It's sort of it's impacted by culture. It's impacted by identity. It's impacted by norms, shared histories, language, etc. Another question or another core concept that will come up in this class is the question of human nature. And I'm not talking about human nature just being inherently good or bad. For international relations scholars, human nature is neither good nor bad. It's just self-interested. Humans, for many international relations scholars, are creatures, and the systems that they develop, like international system, inherently reflects themselves. So what is it? Human nature for them is self-interested. So it's either sort of self-interest or altruism that defines behavior. So it's either cooperation or competition to some. And if you've done any political theory book, you will find, if you read any political theory, if you've gotten into theory as a subdiscipline of political science, you would have read the Leviathan. And Leviathan is a good example of how Western European political theory have addressed the question of anarchy and have addressed the question of self-interest of human nature by sort of saying, you know what? Yeah, human life or life outside of the state is nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes says. So what do? We create a Leviathan. We create an order, that a social contract, that when we come all together, when we're all together, gives us the stability and gives us the order that sort of allows us to prosper in our everyday lives, so that we don't worry about getting killed. We live our lives. We give up certain amount of our rights. So I give up my right to kill someone, or I give up my right to steal from someone. And in return, I get the protection or the sense of protection that someone else will not kill me or someone else will not steal my goods. And that gives me the comfort, or that gives me the idea that sort of I can prosper. I can live as part of a community or society. And, that's the basis of the domestic life, the sort of the law and order. Another concept that we use to discuss self-interest is rational choice. And rational choice is a way of modeling social or economic behavior that privileges maximization of gains and sort of understanding the world in sort of through a relative cost and gains relationship. So you start sort of looking at the world or understanding actions by doing this cost-benefit analysis, where you're sort of saying motivations of actors do not matter. It's actually what matters are the costs or the benefits that you get from interactions. So that's perhaps one way, or we will see one way that people make sense of international politics and how people behave in international politics. Another thing that is important is the idea of structure and agency. And this is complex. This is a complex concept. So these two. And I will sort of try to introduce them now, but then I will get back to them as we sort of move on in the term. So if you don't get it immediately, don't worry about it. But structure are the arrangements that limit and shape choices and actions. So let's give the example of capitalism. Capitalism is the way in which we have arranged our economic interaction. So we have put a value on your labor, we have put a value on services, we have put a value on goods, and we sort of said in a free marketplace, capitalism allows you to make the best informed decision that you can given the number of information that is available to you. So you can sort of say, I know how much this mask will cost, right? So let's say this is 2018 and I'm in the mask business, and someone says, how much do you want for that mask? And I sort of say, you know what, this mask, there's not much demand on it, so I'll give it to you for $5. Now it's 2020 and I'm in the mask business and there isn't enough masks in the world. So I sort of say, you know what, this mask is $200. Well, that's price gauging, but you still probably can get away with it depending on what time or where you are. Now, can I sort of say, you know what, I don't have $200, but I give great hugs. Can I give you $200 worth of hugs? Probably you're laughing, or you're sort of saying, what the fuck is he talking about? See, it did not record the swear word. What you're doing is trying to understand capitalism. You're saying, look, capitalism has its rules. Hug is not a currency. No one's going to accept hug as a currency because the recurrent arrangements of capitalism limits your ability to sort of do certain kinds of actions. Just as the same way that you can't sort of say, you know what? Laws are laws, but I do not believe in your laws. So like you can't just sort of, steal from someone, get caught, and then go to court and sort of say, I do not recognize Canadian court system. Canadian court system will just look at you and laugh. They'll be just like, yeah, you know what? Great, good on you. You're still going to jail. So structure are those recurrent arrangements that bind your choices, bind your agency. And agency is your capability of making rational decisions. So just as this example of the mask, you can make a choice to get this mask or not get this mask because you'll see, you'll understand, you'll spend your money the way that you want because you'll understand given the information in the marketplace. But in international politics, this question of structure and agency becomes important because we sort of ask a different question. We say, which one determines action or inaction in international relations? So when states act to solve COVID-19 or don't do enough to solve COVID-19, is it an outcome of their agency or is it an outcome of the structure? So then can responses to COVID-19 be addressed through or by the agency of states, like, or states, international organizations, global leaders, or citizens? Or does it require structural thinking in that do we have to do things at a level that is not just about individual choices of citizens, agencies, states, but rather global collective action? So that is one way of looking at this through structure and agency. Another way in which that we can sort of approach this is by asking perhaps a question about language. And that is to say, we can ask ourselves a question about discourse when it comes to understanding structure and agency. We can sort of say, okay, you know what? Structure and agency are important, but there is something discursive about this distinction. And discourse refers to practices that systematically form or create the object that they speak of, in the sense that nothing exists outside of language, right? If I sort of say, this is a coffee mug, you'll be like, okay, that's a coffee mug. But what if I sort of said, this is a chair? And you'll be like, no, it's not a chair. But how do you know that this is a chair or not a chair? Because we sort of have an intersubjective understanding that you can't perhaps sit on this. And that we understand that you have to sit on chairs. And a mug is something that you use to have a drink with. So in some ways, it's the language that gives meaning to this as a mug or this as a chair. So that discourse gives meanings to practices and objects as well. But we then use something in social sciences, a tool called deconstruction, which then takes apart the presumed meaning of things. It takes apart images, stories, narratives, ideas. whether we're talking about ideologies or arguments that show the inner workings of things, that often reveal internal contradictions and discontinuities, right? So this morning, after sort of like we had our meet and greet, I was talking to one of your peers, and we were talking about their sort of project for their sort of like honors in a different discipline, where they told me about this sort of tension or this dynamic that exists between a political belief that it is your sort of public health measures impact someone's freedoms. And that sort of like there's a correlation between political preferences and how we sort of approach COVID-19 in the United States. And you will, by taking apart that sort of dynamic, taking apart that sort of tension, you will probably find internal contradictions. Like you can sort of say, well, yeah, like masks could be like, or sort of mandating the use of masks could undermine your personal freedom to not wear a mask. But at the same time, by sort of telling people to wear a mask, you're in the long term getting rid of mask usage because you're trying to curb the pandemic that requires you to wear masks in the first place, right? So this is an idea of deconstruction. You're sort of deconstructing the moving parts. So when I think of deconstruction, I think of this image. This is a Formula One car that is being taken apart to every single piece, every single nuts and bolts of the car, right? So a Formula One car, when it's put together, is a formidable machine. When it's taken apart in individual pieces, you can see what's working, why it's working, how it's working, and it's sort of like not as formidable because it's just a bunch of carbon fiber, whatever, epoxy, whatever, just pieces that they're using, metal, rubber, plastic, etc. International politics is very similar. If you can take it apart to pieces, you'll understand how it's working, why it's doing what it is doing. And we do that through a theory called social constructivism. And social constructivism makes perhaps a key introduction. And I'm not going to get into social constructivism this week. I'm just sort of introducing to you guys this understanding or possibility of what a theory looks like. But international or social constructivists argue that international politics is guided by intersubjectively shared and institutionalized norms, rules, beliefs, and values held by agents. So international politics is a sort of construction of our collective understandings of our capabilities, our desires, our hopes, our aspirations, our current configurations of power. So then, if we take social constructivism to understand COVID-19, we would probably argue that COVID-19 is actually a combination of structural and agency-based decisions and crises, right? So those different kinds of economic crisis, health crisis, security crisis, etc., all come together, and where we are and how we see those different things, how we prioritize different things, inform our ability to understand, react, and do something about or not do something about COVID-19. So if that's what it is, if that's the way that we're going to approach this, through different theories, we perhaps have to ask a different question too. Then we have to ask a question of, then how do we solve the crisis? How do we solve the crisis of COVID-19 through the theoretical perspective that we're studying? And each week, as we sort of go through different understandings, we are going to come up with different explanations. And sometimes we're going to see, and oftentimes we're going to see how dramatically opposing or dramatically different those different perspectives are. And that's just the way that it's going to work out. So you don't have to make a decision, right? This course is not sort of like American Idol or The Voice. You don't have to just turn your chair and sort of say, I choose this theory. You don't have to sort of say, oh, that's going to be a no for me. Thank you. What you're doing is you're trying to understand ways in which different theories, from their point of view, from what they prioritize as a priority, make the case that their approach is the right approach. So that's just a brief synopsis into perhaps some of the key concepts and key ideas that we're going to use in this class. Like, this is not sort of, I'm not going to get into too much detail in the first week or the first lecture, but we're going to slowly build momentum, and you're going to sort of, each week you're going to understand new things. So some of you have already reached out to me to sort of say, hey, you know what? I didn't really get that reading. Like, that reading seems really difficult. And don't worry about it. Don't worry about getting everything in the reading. What you're trying to get at is get a gist of what that reading is saying. So each time you're reading the reading and coming to these lectures and then coming to discussion groups, you're going to understand more and more. And then maybe if you're sort of like really, willing to sort of really make an effort, down the road, when it comes to the finals, you can probably go back to those readings to sort of skim through them again, and you'll probably get more things, hopefully, than you did the first time around. Because that's just the way that it's going to work out. But if you're not getting it, do not be alarmed, because they're not geared towards introductory readings. I'm just throwing you into the deep end of the pool and sort of saying, you know what, you're going to survive. Don't worry, I have a life jacket. But it just feels scary right now, right? Like, pushing you into that deep end is scary for you. It's not scary for me because I've done it a number of times. I push students into that deep end of the pool, and so far no one has drowned, so don't worry about it. Okay, so for the take-home points for this week, we talked about the capital IR versus lowercase IR. Capital IR referring to the discipline of international relations, lowercase IR towards referring to the everyday actions, activities, practices, discourses of world politics. We talked about theory and practice as a sort of a relationship that is central to the discipline of international relations, and we talked about how different understandings of theory related to different understandings of method or methodology and epistemology and ontology. And we talked a little bit about key concepts. I pay the sort of a particular emphasis on structure and agency, but again, don't be alarmed, because this is not the only time we're going to talk about these key concepts. We're going to keep coming back to them. What I just did was to give you guys a little bit of a primer, a little bit of an introduction in sort of some of the core concepts, hoping that you will sort of follow through when you're reading or trying to understand what we're talking about moving on into sort of the next weeks. So I hope this lecture is somewhat helpful. I will post some questions for next week's discussion group, which will be somewhat informed by this week and next week's sort of slides. And then by sort of Friday, I will also post next week's lecture like this one, followed by sort of the questions for next week. So I hope you all have a great week. I hope sort of Hurricane Teddy, if you're in Nova Scotia, doesn't sort of, result in too much of a headache for you, and it's just some rain and some wind. But, if it's not, just take care of yourselves and, have a good weekend or have a good week. Take care.